Hi, my name's Bernadette Hunt. I'm the Vice President of Southland Federated Farmers. We've had a bit of feedback that the complicated rules aren't that easy to follow through some of the paperwork that people are receiving that explains it all. So I've been asked to put together a video to briefly explain some of the key rules. So this one's about intensive winter grazing. I'll also be putting out ones about stock exclusion and about some of the high level stuff in the NPS that affects both town and country. So keep an eye out for those ones as well. But here we go with intensive winter grazing. So basically the intensive winter grazing component of these rules is based around three key steps. The first step is, can you follow the rules? And I'm going to explain the rules in more detail in just a minute. But if you can follow the rules, away you go, do your winter grazing, no problem. If you can't follow the rules, then your next option is to get a certified freshwater farm plan that will give you an exemption from the rules, and I'll explain how that works in just a minute. If you can't get a certified freshwater farm plan, and just bear in mind that nobody can this year because there's no process for it yet and no certifiers, then you need a resource consent. And if you can't get a resource consent, then you can't do the winter grazing in compliance with the rules. So now for a bit more detail about all of that. So first step, can you follow the rules? These are the rules. First one, no more than 50 hectares or 10% of the farm can be used for intensive winter grazing. It's whichever of those numbers is the greater in your case. The second rule is that the average slope of any winter grazing paddock cannot be more than 10 degrees. And that's definitely a challenge in some areas. I know on our farm, for example, we probably haven't got a single paddock that doesn't have an average slope of 10 degrees. So that's going to rule out quite a bit of intensive winter grazing area in some parts of the country. Pugging is an interesting rule. So pugging is defined as the penetration of soil by the hoofs of grazing animals. So a hoofprint is a pug. Pugging of any depth is not allowed over more than 50% of the paddock, of any depth. So that's hoofprints over more than 50% of the paddock are not allowed. And there is not allowed to be any one point where pugging is more than 20 centimetres. That includes around troughs, around bale feeders and gateways, those kinds of places. Stock must be kept at least 5 metres away from the bed of any river, lake, wetland or drain, regardless of whether it's got water in it. And this is a curly one too. You have to replant that paddock after the winter grazing no later than the 1st of November if you're in Otago or Southland Regional Council areas, and no later than the 1st of October if you're anywhere else. So I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the challenges of some of these in just a moment. So that was step one. So if you can follow those rules, you're fine. If you can't, your next option is to get a certified freshwater farm plan. So a certified freshwater farm plan, we're all pretty familiar with what farm plans are meant to be about. Needs to cover your winter grazing practice on the farm and the management techniques you're going to employ. We haven't really got detail about what they have to contain yet, but it does state that it has to cover the intensive winter grazing on the farm. And it also states that the certifier must confirm that the adverse effects of your winter grazing practice will be no greater than if you had followed all those rules I just talked about. So that's the purpose of the certified freshwater farm plan. It will give you an exemption to those rules if you can show that you're going to have no worse effect than if you'd followed them. And just as I mentioned, bear in mind that there's currently no process for getting one of these certified freshwater farm plans yet. So this step is not an option ahead of the crop planting that we're about to undertake, to prepare for winter 2021. So that leaves us with step 3, get a resource consent. So there's 2 levels of resource consent. Restricted discretionary applies if the area of the farm you're using for winter grazing is no greater than the maximum area you used during the 5-year period between mid-2014 and mid-2019. So as long as you don't go over the maximum area that you used in those 5 years, you get to go down the restricted discretionary pathway. Restricted discretionary basically means that the council is restricted to a limited set of criteria that they can look at to determine whether you can get your consent. Having said that, in this case, that list of criteria is pretty broad. Adverse effects on water, basically, multicultural values, as well as likely sediment and contaminant loss to water and how you're going to mitigate those things. If your winter grazing area is larger than you had between those 5 years, then you need to get a discretionary consent, and you'll need to prove that you won't increase the contaminant load in the catchment or the water body as a result of your winter grazing practice. So pretty high bars to get over. So what's the problem with this? The key problem is that there's a seemingly random choice of rules that we need to follow that actually probably won't have any effect on water quality, and they're unworkable and impractical, to put it bluntly. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the 3 biggies. Recropping a paddock by the deadlines provided just doesn't make sense. We know, and it's proven, that when you cultivate a paddock, when the soil conditions are too wet or too cold, you'll have worse adverse effects than if you wait until it's the appropriate ground conditions. The other, and you end up planting seed that might not germinate, and then you've got to go through the whole process again, which is both worse for the soil and a waste of money. The other thing is that those conditions are out of farmers' control and they're unpredictable. So in Southland, we plant our winter grazing paddocks in October, November and December, depending on the crop. That means we need to be looking at applying for resource consents now. And that means we need to be considering right now whether next October and November, or September, October, November, we're going to be able to cultivate those paddocks or not. Totally out of our hands what the weather does between now and then, and in that 3-month period in the lead up, and whether contractors are going to be available when we need them to do it by those deadlines. So to have to predict that far in advance basically means that we all have to get a resource consent, because you just don't know what the conditions are going to be like. Pugging. I think this is relatively self-explanatory from what I told you just before, but yeah, 20 centimetres is a fairly deep mud. But avoiding any single instance of it is really unworkable. We all know that it can get a bit muddy around water troughs and bale feeders and through gateways, and to not allow any hoof prints across more than 50% of the paddock is daft. You can't often do that in the summer. The other real concerning one is the slope limit, which could ultimately result in worse outcomes. On our farm, we know that we're on a geology that has lignite below the surface, and we know that lignite is great for stopping nitrate leaching to waterways. So the slope limit may mean that we have to remove winter grazing from our property to avoid sediment loss. We can mitigate sediment loss really well. We can stop sediment getting to waterways by having buffer zones and things like that. We can't do much about nitrate through the root zone if I was to move all our winter grazing to flat paddocks, nice flat stony paddocks. So this rule just doesn't make sense and is actually likely to result in worse outcomes for water. So why don't we just stop doing intensive winter grazing? Fundamentally, winter grazing is an essential part of the grazing year in places like Otago and Southland, as well as West Coast and even some areas in the North Island where we have next to no grass growth during the winter months. We can't rely on saving the grass for the winter because our conditions often mean that grass just doesn't remain in good quality through the winter months. Even if we go into winter with loads of excess grass, when we have a run of frosts, the quality of that grass is lost and it just isn't good enough to sustain stock on through the winter period. As well as that, our ground gets pretty waterlogged, and putting stock on really waterlogged ground leads to damage. So being able to put them on confined areas of the farm and limit that damage to the smallest area possible, which we can do by growing really intensive crops that feed them on a small area, we can contain the damage. We know it's going to cause damage. It's not ideal, but we can contain it and we can put mitigations in place to minimise the effects of that. Why don't we put them all in a wintering shed? We've got a little wintering shed and we love it, but it's not the answer to all winter grazing in Southland. Often, because of the huge capital outlay required for wintering sheds, they actually result in more intensity so that you can afford to pay for it, i.e. increase your stock and increase your production. They can come with their own challenges in terms of animal welfare and things like that, and some of our supply agreements through our processes and stuff like that to overseas countries don't allow stock to be put in wintering sheds because of our provenance story about grass-fed and outdoor. So we couldn't actually supply to all of New Zealand's contracts if all of our animals were wintered inside. So short answer is winter grazing is here to stay. It's an essential part of the farming system in some parts of the country. We need to find ways of doing it, and we have found ways of doing it that mitigate the effects. We don't need these draconian rules. Fundamentally, intensive winter grazing is the best way to get stock through winter with the least negative impact if it's done right. So what would be better in terms of these rules? Fundamentally, they're not fit for purpose, so we're asking an extension on the implementation date and a complete review and rewrite of them with practical industry input. Good management practice absolutely works, but there's no one size fits all. What works on my farm won't work on other people's farm. Back fences are good in some places, but in other places they just prevent stock getting to shelter. Buffers to waterways, 3 metres is plenty in some places, and in other places you need 10 or more metres to be truly effective. Farmers know what's best for their land and what's most effective on their land. Let them make some good decisions about the right things to do on their farm. Flexibility is absolutely essential. We work with huge variables in this industry, so having inflexible rules just results in layers of bureaucracy down the track when something unexpected happens. The flood situation in Southland this year was one example, and another was the COVID situation that resulted in a whole lot of extra stock being carried into winter that nobody planned for. It just results in more bureaucracy and more workarounds if you've got inflexible rules. Farm plans definitely have their place, and they've been shown to be really effective, but they've got to be farmer driven and farmer owned. We all know what happened with health and safety when all these people popped up doing health and safety plans for people. Great, it allowed you to meet regulation, but the plan sat on a shelf and never actually contributed to better health and safety on farm. We don't want that from farm plans. We want farm plans to be an effective tool that drives good practice. Finally, any rules and regulations got to be focused on effects. You know, we can't just have blanket rules about things like pugging, for example, that make life really difficult for farmers and just make it really difficult for us to do a good job without actually having any benefit on water quality. So whatever we do, it's got to be focused on the actual effects of the practice. So I hope that's been helpful. That's winter grazing rules in a nutshell. We're working hard on this. We absolutely don't buy into these rules because we know they're not fit for purpose, and so we're fighting on your behalf to get this sorted. Cheers for listening.